Hello and welcome to today's lesson. In previous lessons we've looked at the definitions commonly used in genetics. Today we're going to be looking at specific genetic crosses. So if you could write the title in your book as you would do for any other lesson of mine, Genetic Crosses. By the end of today's lesson you should be able to recall what the terms dominant, recessive, heterozygous and homozygous mean. You should be able to explain how someone is a carrier for a disease, and you should be able to create a Punnett Square to determine the genotypes of offspring between two parents. So let's start today's lesson with a definition. The definition is genetically inherited disease. Genetically inherited disease. Now, a genetically inherited disease is a disease that is passed from parents to offspring through their genes. So we can say that it is an illness passed from parents to offspring through genes. Okay, so it's an illness that is passed from parents to offspring through genes. Now, a couple of examples of these, so e.g. would be cystic fibrosis and Huntington's disease. So e.g. cystic fibrosis and Huntington's disease. It's a capital H because it's named after someone called Huntington. Okay? So a genetically inherited disease is an illness that's passed from parents to offspring through genes. Examples of these include cystic fibrosis and Huntington's disease. Now, before we move any further, we need to just quickly recall some definitions from last lesson. Now, I'm not going to write the entire definition out, so to save time, but if you're not sure about these definitions, you need to revisit last lesson's recording and make sure you're happy with them. Otherwise, this lesson is going to be very difficult. So if someone is homozygous dominant, that means that they have two dominant alleles. Okay? So that means they have two dominant alleles. Okay? We know they've got two dominant alleles because they will have two capital letters in their genotype. So they have two capital letters. Someone who is homozygous recessive will have two recessive alleles. So homozygous recessive So homozygous recessive, R-E-C-E-S-S-I-V-E, means that they have two recessive alleles. So have two recessive alleles. If someone is heterozygous, they have one capital and one lowercase. But before we move on, someone who is homozygous recessive will have two lowercase letters. Have two lowercase letters. Okay? If someone is heterozygous, they have one dominant and one recessive. So heterozygous means that they have one dominant, one recessive allele. So they have one dominant and one recessive allele. What this means is that when you look at them, they will have one capital letter and one lowercase letter. So have one capital and one lowercase. One lowercase letter. Now it's important to point out here that whenever we're writing the genotype of an organism, you should always write the two letters as the same. So if you decide to use the letter B, make sure you're using a capital B and a lowercase b. If you decide to use the letter F, make sure you use a capital F and a lowercase f. Sometimes in exams they will tell you what letter to use. So it's important that you always use the same letter. Don't use a capital B and a lowercase w. Okay, apologies, I pressed something on my keyboard. So I'm going to add in red here because it's important. Always use the same letter for genotypes. Okay, so you always use the same letter for genotypes. Don't use two different letters. If you're not sure what a genotype is, you need to go back and have a look at the previous lesson. So we're going to think about cystic fibrosis at the moment, okay? Cystic fibrosis is a pretty disgusting, pretty horrible disease for the sufferer. Essentially what happens is thick mucus develops inside the tubes of their body. So if you think back to when you had your most worst cold, okay, and you couldn't breathe and you had that phlegm and snot stuck on your chest and you just can't cough it up. That's how cystic fibrosis sufferers feel all of the time. They also struggle to gain nutrients from their food because their digestive system has lots of thick mucus lining the tubes, and they also struggle to have children of their own because their reproductive tract has this thick mucus. So we can say that, we'll use this colour, sufferers that's the worst sufferers ever, or we'll just put people with cystic fibrosis develop or make lots of thick mucus that line the airway digestive system and reproductive system. People with cystic fibrosis have to go to the hospital quite frequently to get massages so that the specialist physiotherapists can allow the mucus to come out of their body safely. Sadly though, people with cystic fibrosis do tend to die very early. Okay? So people who have cystic fibrosis tend to die in their 30s and their 40s, sadly. Now, cystic fibrosis is a genetically inherited disease. It's passed from parents to offspring through their genes. But in order to have cystic fibrosis, you must be homozygous recessive for the illness. You must have a recessive allele from your mom and a recessive allele from your dad in order to have the illness. So we can say, and I'm going to put it in red because this is important to understand today's lesson, we can say that cystic fibrosis is a genetically inherited disease full stop. People with the illness are homozygous recessive. Are homozygous recessive. Okay? So in order to have the illness, you must have 2 recessive alleles or 2 lowercase letters. For this reason, parents can be what we call carriers. Okay? Carriers. So that's our next key word. Carrier. Now, a carrier is a person who can pass on a genetically inherited disease without having the illness themselves. So, a person who can pass on a genetically inherited disease without having the illness themselves. Without having the illness themselves. Okay? So a carrier is a person who can pass on a genetically inherited disease without having the illness themselves. Carriers are heterozygous. They have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. You cannot be a carrier if an illness is caused by a dominant allele. Okay? This is because if you have the dominant allele, you have the illness. You only need one dominant allele to have that illness. If you don't understand that, go back and watch our lesson previously to understand it. I explained it in the last lesson. So carriers are always heterozygous. Always heterozygous. Okay? You can't be a carrier if an illness is caused by a dominant allele. So we can say underneath here, if I can fit it, illnesses caused by dominant alleles can't have carriers. Okay? So genetically inherited diseases are illnesses passed from parents to offspring through genes. These include cystic fibrosis and Huntington's disease. If a person is homozygous dominant, they have two dominant alleles or two capital letters in their genotype. Homozygous recessive have two recessive alleles or two lowercase letters in their genotype. And heterozygous people have one dominant and one recessive allele. They have one capital and one lowercase letter. Whenever we are doing the crosses or looking at genotypes, we always use the same letter. So if you decide to use the letter B, always use a capital B and a lowercase b. If you decide to use the letter G, use a capital G and a lowercase g. Okay? In exams, they may give you the letter they want to use. You must use the letter they tell you to use, okay? We're going to be focusing on cystic fibrosis. So people with cystic fibrosis make lots of thick mucus that line the airways. They also line the digestive system and the reproductive system. Cystic fibrosis is genetically inherited and it is caused by a recessive allele. So people with the illness are homozygous recessive. People who are heterozygous for the cystic fibrosis gene are said to be carriers. This is a person who doesn't have the illness themselves, but they can pass it on to their offspring. They are heterozygous. They have one capital and one, lowercase letter in their genotype. Illnesses caused by dominant alleles can't have carriers. Apologies for my handwriting. I'm recording this in a bit of a rush, if I'm honest. It's my lunch break whilst teaching. I'm trying to get it done before I teach my next lesson. So I've been writing all morning. My hands are very, very shaky, if I'm honest. So I'm just trying to get this done as quick as I can. So I'm going to write down first something we said on the previous slide, that people with cystic fibrosis are homozygous recessive. Okay? Are homozygous recessive. And I'm going to try and neaten that up a bit. So in order to have cystic fibrosis, you have to have two recessive alleles. So in your exams, you may be asked to calculate the percentage chance of a person having a child with cystic fibrosis or with a other genetic illness. And we can do this by using what are known as Punnett Squares. It's a key word, so I'm putting it in green. Punnett. Punnett Square. Okay, Punnett Square. Again, apologies for my handwriting. A Punnett square can be defined as a grid used to determine possible outcomes of a genetic cross. Possible outcomes of a genetic cross. Okay? So we can use this to calculate the percentage chance of someone having a child with cystic fibrosis. So we can imagine an exam question, which I'm going to put in blue. I can say, a mother with cystic fibrosis and I can put in brackets CF because that's how I'm going to abbreviate it. Whenever we want to abbreviate something, we write it out first. So a mother with cystic fibrosis wants to have a child with a male carrier. With a male carrier. Calculate the possibility or the probability of their child having cystic fibrosis. Of their child having cystic fibrosis. And I can use CF now because I've abbreviated it earlier. So the way we could do this is we could draw a Punnett square. Now a Punnett square is quite simple really. We do it by drawing two lines that intersect in the top left hand corner, like so. We can put mom's alleles at the top. So mom genotype. And down the side, we can put dad's genotype. Now, if you think back to last lesson, we said that the genotype is always shown as two letters. So mom, it says in the question, suffers with cystic fibrosis. So a mother with cystic fibrosis. We've said earlier that to have cystic fibrosis, you have to be homozygous recessive. So you have to have two lowercase alleles. For the case of this Punnett square, I'm going to choose to use the letter C. So mom has got cystic fibrosis, so she can only give two lowercase c's. Dad, on the other hand, is a carrier. Okay, so it says in the question that the male, the dad, is a carrier. We said on the previous slide that a carrier is someone who is heterozygous. So Dad, remember I must use the same letters, is heterozygous, so I can show that with a capital C and a lowercase c. What I then do is I go across filling in each row. So Dad can only give a capital C here and can only give a capital C here. Dad can only give a lowercase c here and a lowercase c here. I then do the columns. It doesn't matter which way around you do it, it's just I'm choosing to do that. So Mom can only give a lowercase c here and Mom can only give a lowercase c here. Mom can only give a lowercase c here. Mom can only give a lowercase c here. Now, because this is divided into 4, we have got 4 different possible outcomes, each worth a quarter, each worth 25%. So these are carriers. So their genotype would be a capital C and a lowercase c, but their phenotype would be that they are carriers. So this one would be a carrier, and this one would be a carrier. These 2 at the bottom have only got lowercase alleles. Therefore, they would be homozygous recessive, and therefore they would have cystic fibrosis. These children would suffer from cystic fibrosis. Okay? Each cross is worth 25%. So we could say that they have got a 50% chance of having a child with who is a carrier, and a 50% chance of having a child who has the illness. So each cross is worth 25%. I'm going to put in red because it's important. Each cross is worth 25%. Okay? So this couple have a 50-50 chance of having a child that is a carrier or a child with cystic fibrosis. So there is a 50-50 chance or a 50% chance of having a child with cystic fibrosis. Okay? Now, this is using a Punnett square. We can also show this using a genetic diagram, and these are a bit more messy. So with a genetic diagram, however, it's worth mentioning purely because you may see it in your exam. With a genetic diagram, they will use lots of circles, okay? So the mom's genotype will be given in one circle, and the dad's genotype will be given in another. So mom is homozygous recessive, dad is a carrier, so he has a heterozygous genotype. We would then draw arrows to show the possible genes or the possible alleles each parent can provide. So we would draw some circles, or you would be given some circles, into which we would put the gametes. So remember, mom's egg can only ever contain a lowercase c, whereas dad's sperm, because he has this dominant allele, could contain a dominant allele or a lowercase allele. You would then draw arrows to show how this cross may look. So if this gamete crosses with this gamete, if this gamete crosses with this gamete, if this gamete crosses with this gamete, it does get very messy, and if this gamete crosses with this gamete. The only reason I'm showing you this is because sometimes it does come up in exams, and when we're in the classroom, pupils get very confused with it. It shows exactly the same thing. So if mom provides this gamete here, that is a lowercase c. If she provides it there, it's a lowercase c. If she provides it there, it's a lowercase c. And if she provides it there, it's a lowercase c. Whereas if dad provides this one here, it would be a dominant allele. So you would have one dominant, one lowercase. You would always put the dominant one first, but because of the way I've drawn it, I can't do that now. With this one, it would be a lowercase c. With this one, it would be a capital C. And with this one, it would be a lowercase c. Again, each of these crosses show a 25% chance. So we can still write in our phenotypes. So this one would be a carrier, and so would this one. This one would have cystic fibrosis, and this one would have cystic fibrosis, okay? Again, each cross would be worth 25%. So each cross is worth 25%. This is exactly the same way as showing this, but a Punnett square is much neater and much easier to follow, okay? So people with cystic fibrosis are homozygous recessive. We can predict the probable outcomes of people having a child with cystic fibrosis using a Punnett square. A Punnett square is a grid used to determine possible outcomes of a genetic cross. The question we asked was, a mother with cystic fibrosis wants to have a child with a male carrier. Calculate the probability of their child having cystic fibrosis. We would draw the Punnett square. We would put the mom's genotype on one line, the dad's genotype on the other. Unless the exam asks in a particular order, it doesn't matter which way round you put that, okay? However, sometimes in an exam, they'll give you the headings. However, if it's not given you the headings, it doesn't really matter which way round you do it. Dad is a carrier, so he has one dominant allele, one lowercase allele. Mom has cystic fibrosis, so she has two lowercase alleles. We would then do the rows and then write in the columns. From doing this cross, it tells us that they have a 50% chance of having a child that is a carrier and a 50% chance of a child that has cystic fibrosis, as each cross is worth 25%. Let's see if you can do one yourself now, and then I'll ask you to pause the video and I will then go over the answer. So we'll say a mother with cystic fibrosis wants to have a child with a man without the illness and is not a carrier. Full stop. Calculate the probability of their child having cystic fibrosis. So you're calculating the probability of their child having cystic fibrosis. So a mother with cystic fibrosis wants to have a child with a man without the illness and is not a carrier. Calculate the probability of their child having cystic fibrosis. Pause the video now, have a go at it, draw a Punnett square and have a go, and then press play when you're ready to go over the answer. Right then, you should have paused the video and had a go at that question by now. Let's calculate their probability. So we would draw a Punnett square by drawing two lines that intersect in the top corner. We could put mom's genotype or mom's alleles on the top, and we could put dad's genotype or dad's alleles on the side. So dad, don't spell Gino with an M, dear. Dad's genotype on the side. In the question, it tells us that the mother has cystic fibrosis. Therefore, she must be homozygous recessive. She must have two lowercase alleles because she's got the illness. Whereas dad does not have cystic fibrosis and he is not a carrier. Therefore, dad only has dominant alleles. Dad doesn't have any lowercase alleles because he's not a carrier and he doesn't have the illness. So he must be homozygous dominant. We can fill in the rows first, capital C, dad's down here, capital C, capital C. We can then fill in mom's alleles. She can only provide lowercase c's. Therefore, the phenotype of their child will be a carrier here, a carrier here, a carrier here, and a carrier here. If each child or each cross is worth 25%, they have 100% chance of having a child that is a carrier. Their child will be a carrier. Okay? So when I'm doing this, what I'm doing is I know that mom is homozygous recessive. Dad must be homozygous dominant. Therefore, their cross will only make carrier children. So they have a 100% chance of having a child, of having a carrier child. Okay? Now, if we're talking about a different disease, so for example, and I'm going to have to be quick because of how long we've been going, Huntington's is caused by dominant alleles okay? If we wanted to do a cross for Huntington's, if we've got a person who is homozygous dominant and a person who is homozygous recessive, so if let's pretend that mom is homozygous recessive, in fact I'm going to use a different letter, I'm going to use the letter H, so a lowercase h here and a lowercase h here, whereas dad is homozygous dominant, so dad does have Huntington's disease. If we did a cross between these two, every single one of their child, or all that they would have 100% chance of having a child with Huntington's. Okay? Now this is because it's carried on a dominant allele, and if you remember last lesson, we said that dominant alleles are always expressed. So these would have Huntington's, these would have Huntington's, these would have Huntington's, and these would have Huntington's. So their child would definitely have a 100% chance of having Huntington's. So I'm just going to write here, only, it's in regs, it's important, one dominant allele is needed for the illness, therefore we can say they have a 100% chance of having a child with Huntington's. So 100% chance of a child with Huntington's. Right then. So, you should now be able to tell me what the words dominant, recessive, heterozygous and homozygous mean. You should be able to tell me how someone can be a carrier for a disease, and you should be able to draw a Punnett square to determine the genotypes of offspring between two parents. If you have any questions about today's lesson at all, please do not hesitate to get in contact with me via email or Google Classrooms. If you do get everything great, I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.